Hello and welcome once again to another edition of the Sporty Usher podcast. This is Dave, and with me as always is my co-commentator through this weird and wonderful world of sport. It's James. How are you doing, James?
I am doing very well, Dave, and hasn't it been a good week for sport?
I would say it has been an incredible sport. Scotland won 3 games in a week, James, so I would say it's an unprecedented week for sport, but we will get to that all in good time. Coming up this week on the Sporty Usher podcast, we will look back at the French Open, just my one-word review, rubbish, I think is what I would say. We'll see how the Brits got on at the Giro d'Italia. Not very well would be again like spoiling that. We'll have a chat about our team in the IPL, the Rajasthan Royals, see how they're getting on. But most of the night, I'm going to say, is going to be devoted to talking about football. So the international break, we'll go over how the home nations got on, and we will preview what is coming up in the SPFL and the Premier League, with both the Merseyside and the Old Firm derbies taking place on Saturday. So all that to come on tonight's Sporty Usher podcast. Okay, James, so I am probably still in a bit of a state of shock, if I'm honest. So Scotland, for the first time ever, well, the first time since the 1960s, played a game in extra time in the semi-final of the European Championship playoff, and went to their first ever penalty shootout. Now, I remember texting you during that, or just after it, saying, I never want to go through that again. And your simple response was, try losing one, which I can, my sympathy for you is even more. But I am getting ahead of myself slightly. So before we go to talk about probably one of the best weeks in Scottish football history, especially, well, at least in the last 30 years, we'll talk about some other sports before we get there. So let's start with the French Open. Now that so we're recording this on Thursday, the 15th of October. So that finished on Sunday, just gone, with Nadal Djokovic in the final. Now, going into this, James, neither of us were particularly excited about the French Open. Neither of us are particularly excited about the French Open anyway, but given the fact that, it was getting played in October, Nadal just seems to win it every single time, and then the last time we spoke was the day that Serena had withdrawn. So like the whole, will she equal the record? That was all out of there. And I think the day after our podcast team went out. So I just think the tournament was just a bit rubbish, wasn't it?
I think so our kind of problem, I'll speak for you, Dave, but my problem with the French Open was that, it's a little bit predictable, and as great as Rafael Nadal is, he's not really challenged properly on that tournament, on that surface in this tournament. And basically that's what happened. That's what happened kind of this.
He didn't lose a set, did he?
Last week. Yeah. And then when he plays the best player in the world, Novak Djokovic, even he can't compete with Nadal in the men's final anyway. So the men's tournament was, I mean, I don't want to say it's a total write-off, but and I suppose you do have to say, like, the fact that Nadal has won 13
so he equaled Roger Federer's streak of 20 Grand Slams. 13 of them have been at the French Open, which, they start saying, who's the greatest between the two of them? For me, it's not a contest. Federer by a country mile. Because if you take the French Open, then Nadal's won 7. And I think Nadal's only won Wimbledon like twice or something, hasn't he? Which is like don't get me wrong, Nadal is a great player, etc. Right? And so is Djokovic. But there's just nobody touches Federer for me. But anyway, so go back to the French. So I think that men's tournament was over when Dominic Thiem went out. I think wasn't it? Because he was really the only person that would have given Nadal a game. And I think the only competitive, sort of interesting game that I watched was Djokovic against was it Tsitsipas in the semi-final?
Oh yes, yeah.
And that at least you saw one of the top guys actually getting challenged, but then as the longer that game went on, you knew that Djokovic, the longer that game went on, the less chance Djokovic had beating Nadal, because he went 5 sets. He's just like, there's absolutely no way that he's getting anywhere. He's not getting anywhere near Nadal on his best day, but if he's got 5 sets in his legs, then especially like the mental toughness of like being pegged back from 2 up to, he won the 5th set relatively easily, 6-1, I think. But I still think, looking at the scores, like Nadal won 0-2-5, and it was just this. When I watched, to be honest, I watched the first set. I just turned it off. At 6, I was like, there's just isn't a contest. Much more interesting, though. Yes. Much more interesting on the women's side. I think when Serena went out, then that just became anyone's, didn't it? But it's just so nice to see like the joy in that young girl's face when she won that was just absolutely. Is it Swiatek? Is that how you pronounce her name? Yeah. And Kenin is like, I remember she had a really good US Open as well, so it was no mean feat for her. She's just 17 or 18, I think she was. And,
19,
so it's just so over. So sum up the French Open for us, James, in a couple of words.
I think, how about this? A game of 2 halves.
Right,
because the men's side was totally predictable, and the women's side was, let's be honest, as it does quite often, was actually a far superior kind of tournament in general. Really,
I think so. Especially in France, I think the French Open in the men's side is always just pretty dull, particularly. And I think you touched on it the last time we spoke. Is like if you are big and powerful, you're going to win on clay. So and we saw that when Murray took on Wawrinka. He couldn't. He could normally he would have put up a better fight on grass or on hard court, but there's just nowhere to hide on clay. He's just got overpowered.
There's no kind of nuance. Well, there can be, but what if when your power gets to a certain level, any nuance you've got in your game, doesn't really. You can't really compete like with the power. One thing I want to say about Swiatek is that she's a big AC/DC and Guns N' Roses fan as well. So that's going to be a tick for me against her.
If you didn't like her before, then I'm sure you do now. So so I think usually the US Open sort of brings an end to the sort of Grand Slam calendar, but it's kind of flipped, and it was the French. And to be honest, I didn't really watch much of it. And as I say, I wasn't too surprised by the outcome. So I'm quite happy to sign the French Open to the history books.
Yes.
So the Giro d'Italia, so that's the second of the Grand Tours. Now, Geraint Thomas goes for Britain, or Team Ineos, having not been risked in the Tour de France. He led the team in Italy. So how did he get on, James?
So he didn't have the best start, and then he had a really bad crash. A really, really bad crash. I think it's been confirmed that he fractured his hip with the crash that he was in. A really, really sort of absolute terrible kind of injury to happen. That's the thing about cycling is you've got like no protection at all. You are just like
if you go down, then
there's no padding at all on with the uniform they wear, or even on their bodies. They're all sinew and muscle, aren't they? There's nothing. So like a crash like that was just really bad, and that kind of like that ended his season, at least. And again, and like we said, like Andy Murray, hopefully he can build up his strength, and we can look at 2021 as another kind of thing for him to have got one of the major tours. So the other British hope that we had going in there was Simon Yates, whose brother Adam Yates had done very, very well in the Tour de France. Had sort of wore the yellow jersey kind of early on, and sort of fell down the order a little bit, and still ended up in the top 10. So still a very, very impressive kind of performance. Simon Yates, however, kind of started to lose time, and then pretty much the worst thing that can happen, he kind of tested positive for coronavirus.
Oh dear.
Had to kind of pull out. So all in all, a bit like the French Open was, a bit of a disastrous kind of tour for the British ride. Well,
wasn't there some kind of crash that like one of the riders like had a reported broken back because of it was like a drone or something, or a helicopter?
The helicopter kind of knocked the knocked the barriers into the road, and everyone kind of like crashed it. Yeah, it's been I mean, as well as the Tour de France kind of did, and as well as certain tournaments have done, like around the world. So we sort of said the US Open seemed to do very, very well, and the obviously the England cricket team, cricket board sort of put on a really good sort of thing. The French Open seems to have worked kind of okay. The Giro d'Italia though seems to be having, whether through luck or design, they seem to be being hit quite badly with kind of positive tests and the sort of accidents that sort of shouldn't be happening. It seems to be every so often you do get something silly happen with I don't know, a following car being too close to the riders or something like that.
Yeah, so I've just seen breaking news in sort of like the last hour or so that the EF Pro team has called to end the race early because they feel that the coronavirus bubble has been compromised, because there's been quite a few riders now have tested positive. So it'll be interesting to see what comes in that in the next 24 hours.
Yes, Simon Yates, like I mentioned, his whole team actually pulled out because they've had a few more positive tests as well, and another team pulled out. So yeah, it's basically it's that sort of situation of, do you just literally just continue it and you end up with the team just pulling out from sort of a safety perspective?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's the sporting integrity anyway. It seems to be very much undermined by what is, you know, cycling's not got the highest profile outside of the Tour de France.
Sure.
And the Giro d'Italia is like winning. Well, imagine like for us, like Wimbledon is the big tournament, whereas you know the French Open might be something we slightly don't quite regard as highly. The rest of the world it is just as tough a tournament to win, and the Giro d'Italia is just as tough, maybe not quite as tough, but it is like the second.
Yeah, so it's like I think that's a really good way of describing it. You've got the 3 Grand Tours, don't you? You've got the Vuelta in Spain, and they're kind of like the tennis Grand Slams in as much as if you live in England, then you know Wimbledon's the big one. If you live in France, then it's the French Open, etc. So we'll watch with interest to see what happens with the Giro, and if we talk next week, we'll see if it has, because it's due to finish on the 25th of October. So things keep going the way it's going, and you can't see it, you know, going that distance, can you? Okay, so it has been a relatively kind of quiet sort of week for sport in terms of, you know, like or at least the sports that tickle the Sporty Ushers fancy. The only other thing that we'll mention briefly, we talk a little bit too much about Formula One on this podcast, but we will talk about it again because Lewis Hamilton won at the weekend in the Eifel Grand Prix. Which I assumed was in France until I actually sat down to watch it, and it was actually in Germany, which was interesting. But so, you know, what more can we? Although not being massive fans of Lewis Hamilton as a guy, we have talked about him in glowing terms, you know, in his terms of how he's kind of held F1 to account over racism and how his stance on Black Lives Matter. But I think we need to talk about him as a driver because he has pulled Schumacher's record, and I imagine we'll beat it in the coming weeks. Is he going to go down in history as the best driver of all time?
I think
20 years time. You go 20 years down the line, right? Nobody, you know, Schumacher and Senna and all these guys, you know, and you look at it, like even long after Hamilton's retired, where does he rank, do you think? Is he going to go down in history as the best? Or
I do think that there will always be people who will say that, you know, a Fangio or a Senna, just because of the kind of the artistic flair that they seem to have over someone like Lewis Hamilton, or especially Michael Schumacher, is kind of regarded as an absolute machine who just churned out like lap after lap of just getting faster and faster. Whereas you know, your Sennas and those sort of, you know, the stereotypical flamboyant kind of South American Latin temperament, kind of that kind of, to a certain set of fans, that they will always be almost untouchable. And the achievements of a Lewis Hamilton or even a Schumacher just don't stack up against this kind of flair. But I definitely think already, I mean, statistically, he is now the most successful. Well, sorry, I mean, in 3 weeks' time, anyway, he will have proved himself to be the most successful kind of like Formula One driver of all time. And I think there are rivals who don't see him as sort of legitimate. If you look on Twitter, there'll be people saying he's the luckiest driver of all time. There's a famous, I think it's Gary Player, the golfer, who says that it's strange. The more I practice,